My name is Najla Al-Dah and I am your host. Before we start our session, please make sure you select the English channel and the interpretation button down below if English is your preferred language. للي حابين يسمعوا الحوار باللغة العربية فممكن إنهم يغيرون أسفل الشاشة القناة من اللغة الإنجليزية. At the bottom bar in your Zoom screen, you will also find the Q&A tab. So drop us your questions and we'll get to them towards the end of our talk. You can also find us streaming live on YouTube on Shuruq's channel at Shuruq SHJ. Ever since modern art and architecture found its way into the city's fabric, the question of traditional or modern has been raised. Until our day, we see some architects choosing sides, while others try to find the best of both worlds. To share their perspectives and ideas around this topic, I would like to welcome our speakers. We have Mr. Jonathan Ashmore, founder and director at An Architect, Mr. Mikkel Schlesinger, partner and architect at Zebra, and Mr. Wael Masri, founder and chief architect at Wael Masri Planners and Architects. Thank you for participating in our talk. If you may just please, let's begin by introducing yourself and your consultancy to the audience and the work that you have been doing. So Jonathan, maybe we can start with you.
Hi, Najla, thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Ashmore, and I'm the founder and principal architect of Dubai and London-based Practice and Architect. We're a boutique RIBA chartered practice, and we focus a lot on design-driven projects, working with existing contexts, also working within new build interiors and exteriors. Personally, I've been in the UAE for over a decade, and we established the company in 2013. I think it's an interesting subject, particularly talking around buildings within the Gulf itself, about where we've got the opportunities within elements of tradition and the complexities of modernity and bringing the two together. So hopefully we'll have some good discussions, but thanks again.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Mikkel, can we move to you?
Yeah, my name is Mikkel Schlesinger. I'm partner in Zebra. We are a Danish design firm and architecture firm who set up office in Abu Dhabi 5 years ago after winning the competition for the Qasr Hosn project in Abu Dhabi, and we've been set up there since. And what we've been working with is trying to bridge traditional architecture with modern life, and try to kind of redefine the way that we do modern architecture in the region.
Thank you so much, Mikkel. Wael?
I was born in Kuwait in 1959 and did my education, the bachelor's degree in Manchester University, and my master's thesis at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I worked in Kuwait for a long time, and I established my office in Amman, Jordan, in 2009. Most of the projects that I've been working on are in the Gulf region, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and from the year 2007 until now, I have been concentrating on work in Sharjah with Shuruq, basically, and I've been trying to kind of advocate an approach for design, for architectural design, which I called hybrid architecture, that tries to blend tradition with modernity and express the cultural, the changing cultural identities of societies in the region. So architecture as an expression of this culture, rather than kind of indulging in the kind of polarization that we have been seeing, you know, whether you do something that is very traditional or very contemporary or very modern, something that is related to the past against something that is imported from the West. I've been trying to find a formula to bridge the gap between all these different architectural conditions and make it really reflect the cultural identities of the societies in the region.
Great, great to have you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we can move to the most interesting part of our talk. So my very first question, it goes to you, Jonathan. Do you believe the words traditional are actually opposites to each other in the world of architecture and design?
I think actually, they're actually intrinsically linked in a way, because traditional, in an essence, is something that's long-standing. It's something that passes on through different generations. Yes, it evolves, but it's something that's actually almost a cultural connection with either some tradition or a traditional element of architecture in the way you use that. But also, in the same way, modernity is present. It's something that's right now, that's kind of relevant. So in a real kind of looking at it on a larger perspective, something that was traditional to us now was actually modern at some previous period during time. And if it was actually successful, it actually became intrinsically embedded within architecture and the society and the connection between architecture and community to then become something that's interpreted into a tradition. And it doesn't necessarily have to be confused with heritage either, where heritage is something that's maybe something fixed and inherited and passed down, that almost sometimes becomes something that's almost artifact, where actually tradition, a bit like vernacular, but tradition actually can evolve, and it's a way in which we maybe interact. So I think they're actually intrinsically linked. And I think what's an important aspect when you're looking at the sort of interpretation of architecture and the words tradition and modern, it's about layers of buildings. So for example, some of the projects that we've done with Sharjah, the quite well-known Al-Fire Lodge retreat, the key thing about that was actually understanding what layers are important, what layers you can either contrast or sympathize with, and how you then bring those together. But in essence, that project had to keep a certain sensitivity of tradition, because that's the reason that project was there. It had this sense of connection with the landscape. So I think, realistically, it's looking over a period of time. Both tradition and modern are actually intrinsically connected, and it's just our evolution of what point you're looking at it, whether it's present or you're looking at it from the past.
Yeah, exactly, just like you said, it's a perspective basically, and then we sort of adapt to it and evolve. So yeah, that's really, really great. Thank you. When it comes to modern architecture through time, what mainly brought it up, let's say, is the use of new materials at the time, such as steel and concrete, the possibilities technology have brought upon, and the ideas of functionality and minimalism, basically. So, Mikkel, is innovation and forward thinking tied only with modern architecture? You're on mute.
I'll just share my screen.
All right.
Can you see the image?
Yes.
All right. So I believe actually that tradition is very, very often innovative. And the reason why tradition became tradition is because it has an innovative element, and it responded quite well to the challenges that met. So if we look at traditional architecture, it's extremely innovative, and it actually achieves building or performing with very, very few means and using local materials only. If we look at the challenges that we face right now with climate change and with the need to build with local resources without spending too much energy, there's a lot to be learned and looking at traditional architecture. And we spend a lot of time studying some of the archetypes of the UAE architecture and seeing how they performed, and if there's anything that we can learn moving forward and trying to redefine the way that modern architecture is perceived in the UAE. And if we look at a building like this, it's extremely simple, but it performs extremely well. So it provides, with this small bargil here, it provides natural ventilation in the courtyard and in the hut here, with only one material, barasti mat or palm weave. It provides privacy, it provides protection from the wind, it filters the air and creates a less dusty environment, and it provides shelter and shade for the inhabitants. So looking at that and comparing it to what we normally see in modern architecture, there's a lot of innovation here that we can reintroduce and learn a lot from. And also, if you look at the more established houses and architectures, like here in the heart of Sharjah, there are so many innovative details that we can simply just reintroduce and start learning from and start reintroducing or reusing in an innovative way in modern architecture. Mm-hmm. And we can also see that some of the first modern heritage that we have actually understood that and provided natural shading, provided natural ventilation, a transition between the indoors and the outdoors that is often lost when you look at modern architecture in the UAE. Another good example is this building that we just finished refurbishing, the Cultural Foundation building in Abu Dhabi, where again there's a minimal sun on the facades, but a building, as soon as you step into this transition between outdoors and indoors, it opens up and becomes very transparent. So there's a lot to be learned, and actually a lot of these buildings, both traditional and modern heritage, are extremely innovative and also can teach us a lesson about how to make architecture again today. And if we compare to some of the more the modern buildings that are being built, some of those points are kind of lost, and we believe that looking back at traditional and buildings, and combining it with a contemporary design language, there's a lot to both learn and to develop. One example is the project that we just finished at Castle Hausen, where we tried to take some of these learnings by providing shading, using heavy materials that can absorb heat, using light surfaces that can reflect the sunlight, creates and doing these transitions between indoors and outdoors creates a more pleasant place to be, and also something that relates more closely to nature and to the surroundings. Mm. So definitely there's a lot of innovation that we just have to look at and can just learn from and reintroduce in modern architecture.
Yeah, of course. And that's the thing, innovation is not just tied to technology. It's and at the time that was the technology, just like you showed us, the use of the veracity, the use of the shade, all these different elements. This was the technology actually. So I feel like this is also for us to think and for the next architects to come to think of, it's what defines that term. How do we look at it? So thank you for that. Also, we've discussed in previous talks how sustainability and city resilience, they call for restoration and preservation rather than demolishment. So Wael, do you think historic buildings should keep their original function, or is adaptive reuse the key to reviving the past?
Well, I think keeping the original functions may apply to few building types. For example, places of worship continue to function as such because of the original religious use does not change over time. They may need maintenance and additions of modern services, but their functions remain the same. Traditional souks, for example, in old Arab cities, bazaars and souks can continue to be used in their original commercial functions. However, in most cases, functions change because of that. We need to look at new uses for these buildings, to maintain them, like ports, for example, for defensive purposes. They become, museums. Houses are the main stock of the urban fabric, and in many cases, in our part of the world, they get deserted when the original owners move out into new neighborhoods. One way is to convert some of these old houses into museums, but when you have many of them, then adaptive reuse for new functions will bring these buildings back to life in our contemporary and modern times. They may be reused as offices, restaurants, workshops, schools, art galleries, lodges, or small hotels, for example. That's much better than just keeping them all into museums, because you don't need all that to be in that kind of typology. There are several old cities in the Arab world where we can find successful adaptive reuse of old buildings. I really would like to mention Marrakesh as an excellent example of an old city which contains many houses that have been turned into little lodges or hotels they call riads, which are really absolutely fantastic places for tourists to stay in. And they turn some of the houses into beautiful restaurants or workshops for local aircrafts, for handicrafts. The heart of Sharjah also has several old houses that have been turned into different functions like cultural centers, workshops, and we have Al Bayt Hotel, which incorporates a number of the old houses that have been restored as part of the comprehensive fabric that the hotel occupies in the heart of Sharjah, creating a wonderful experience for visitors. So yes, adaptive reuse is crucial for the sustainability of old cities and gives the old buildings new life. And we should really not just think about restoring buildings and leaving them empty. We should really try to find new functions that kind of give them that kind of life.
Yeah, and just like you said, museums will give you, an interesting aspect of things, but then what about the other functions? And even turning it into something like a riad or a boutique hotel, you learn a lot just by walking in there and experiencing it yourself. So opening it up out there is probably more cherishing rather than keeping them safe and not visited. I feel we're doing them justice in that term. So yeah, thank you, Wael.
Thank you.
I would just like to remind our attendees that the talk is being translated to Arabic live. So بس حبيت أذكركم إن حاليا في ترجمة لايف مباشرة، فممكن إن أنتم تغيرون القناة. So, Jonathan, I would like to know, how do you see the merge of both styles? Is it a disservice to classical structures and the architects who designed them, or do you believe that traditional buildings should be preserved as is rather than tampered with?
It's a good question, and it kind of leads on from what you were just discussing with Wael.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea is obviously it's about what's relevant and what's worthwhile saving in regards, not all architecture can be saved. We evolve and we grow and different requirements mean different types of buildings through time. But I think, certain traditional elements that have value should be kept. And again, it's like I said in the previous answer, it's about layers. It's about how you get this sort of diversity within the urban fabric so that people can understand layers. In a city, it's progression, it's natural progression. It also adds character. So you define what is Marrakesh, how does Marrakesh feel? You define what is the heart of Sharjah and the traditional kind of bastakir within Dubai and things like that actually create a character that help to define a place. So if you just eradicate anything that's from pre-existence, you lose character and you lose this purpose of actually having place and of-place architecture. Often those off-place architecture were driven by vernacular needs. It was about, as Mikhail was talking about, the reinterpretation about how it relates to the sun, looking at the layering and how it is according to the climate in Abu Dhabi and Sharjah versus the climate in Denmark, in the UK, or in Central Europe. Those things are element. But I think another point is about being relevant and being able to access. So these classical buildings shouldn't just always be considered as artifacts or as museums. And as you actually did say, Najla, you need to access them in order to appreciate that classicism or that traditional architectural relevance that was there and the reason it happened. You need to be able to exist and be able to occupy and be able to visit and understand the history of it. Mm-hmm. So I think in a way, it's about, what is old and what is new and what is relevant. And I think in the way that we look at traditional buildings and we look at old buildings, is trying to bring out the very best of them, understand why they can still be used nowadays. Can they be brought to a certain relevance? And I think also that it might lead on to our other projects. And the next layer is about where you add additional layers of new and old, and you actually express what is this traditional aspect, and then you highlight something that's valuable in contrast with something, or sympathetically with something that's new, that you're actually reprogramming the building so that people will come and see those values from a historic period of a building and why that has been worthwhile preserving. I think it's all kind of interconnected. And I think it's very important that, for me, this urban fabric, this character, this definition of place, this layering over decades and centuries is actually an important part of, each city and each country to continue their legacy.
Yeah. And picking up from what Jonathan about, like the urban fabric, Michaela, I'd like to know your views on this. So the growth of urban development, it correlated to the needs of the society at the time. So a certain building is, built with a specific function, and then according to that, that urban sprawl happened. And now the city is kind of planned based on a top-down approach where, decision makers, they're deciding what goes where and how it is. So the influence radius of a certain building is inherently limited if we compare it to the past. So do you think modern architecture can be as contextually responsive as a traditional building or that urban development in the past?
Well, it is a challenge and it is a danger if you look at buildings separately and don't look at the between the buildings. That is actually what is the city in a way. So it is extremely important that in between is part of the design of the building. And one way of doing it is to look very carefully at the landscaping around the building. And then I'd like to again show an example here. So, sorry. So for this project, we had two existing very prominent buildings. One is the Castle Hosn Fort, the old home of the Sheikh in Abu Dhabi. The other one is a modern heritage building over here, the Culture Foundation, that also has a great importance in culture because it's the first library, the first theater, the first cafe, and the first visual arts center of Abu Dhabi. And our scope on this side was to create a park around it, but also to do a series of new build on the site and turning it into a contemporary cultural center. And how do you do that? How do you build into a context like that in a responsive way without overpowering the cultural anchors and the heritage of the site? That was the big challenge, and I think we did 4 or 5 different iterations of the design where we kept kind of downtoning it and actually doing less and less as we went on, and ended up with a design response that was purely landscape in a way. So even the buildings turned into landscape. So that at least for us in this case, that was a strategy for a very, very responsive and contextual kind of architecture that where buildings and landscape are merging to actually to underline the quality of the existing heritage buildings. So we looked around Abu Dhabi Island and looked at the landscape typologies there, and looked at the subcrust, the mud flats or the salt flats surrounding the coastal all along the UAE coast, and looked at these kind of mud cracks that are typical for the subcrust, and that became a design inspiration that kind of guided both the landscape design and also the building design. So that meant that kind of by using that, we could create a typology for the architecture that was a kind of mix between landscape and building, and that clearly kind of becomes part of the soil or the desert landscape and not part of the surrounding city. So that's a way of responding to the context, is actually, instead of pointing to your own building, then actually pointing to the landscape or the city around it, and enhance that in a way by creating a landscape that becomes a kind of background for the city and for the important buildings on the side. Here's the look back at the fort. And then once we established that, we kind of went mad with it, and also introduced it as an interior design tool. So it's kind of the same landscape that transpires throughout the projects, both on the inside and the outside. So at least that's one way of a very contextual approach, looking at the local landscape and trying to mix that with the buildings in respect of the existing context.
I must say that was beautiful, the mosque.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really nicely said. You were mentioning how we need to understand from that and pick it up from the past, move it along. So this leads me to my next question to you, Wael, where traditional architecture was built using available materials in a context-respecting environment by simply creating spaces that function due to the lessons learned from nature. So years after applying the principles of modern architecture, we started questioning the sustainability of it and sort of went back to traditional foreign answers. So what is the right equation?
Well, I don't know if there's a right equation, but there are approaches, and I adopt one of these approaches. But just to go back a little bit, modernization, especially in the Gulf region, was very fast due to the oil boom from the 1950s onwards, and this resulted in the demolition of substantial parts of the old cities in the region and replaced them with modern developments, which did not carefully take into account the local environmental and cultural values. This has resulted, in my view, in a kind of alienation in the built environment. And this reflected on a feeling of cultural loss, especially as globalization swept over the region during the past 2 decades. So there's an environmental aspect to it, and there's a visual aspect, and there's also a cultural aspect, which is actually important to keep in mind. As an architect practicing in this region for 40 years now, I became aware of this paradox: how to become modern and return to resources at the same time, how to revive our old civilization and take part in universal civilization. How to adopt imported Western technologies while respecting our local environment and cultural values, to belong to the large world outside and still proudly express our local identities. Since the 1980s, I have been trying to find architectural solutions that address these questions, and of course your question. I became more interested in traditional architecture and trying to learn from it what inspires our modern design sensibilities and needs to create the right balance, or that kind of equation. I call my design approach hybrid architecture. using modern design theories and technologies while still referring to traditional typologies, traditional scales and themes, and sometimes even the sentimental aspects, the visual parts, which are, because we are kind of societies who have a lot of attachment to our history and roots, and there's that kind of sentimental part to architecture, trying to bring back the spirit of our heritage and to respect our specific place and culture. I would like to show a couple of our recent projects in Sharjah with Shuruk to illustrate this particular approach.
Okay, please, thank you.
Here. Okay. The first project is Al-Majaz Waterfront on Khaled Lagoon in the center of the city. This project creates a dialogue between nature and the city, contrasting the human scale architecture of the project and the landscape around it with the surrounding high-rise urban context. On the lagoon side, I'm trying to move into the next slide.
I think if you just click on the...
Okay.
Yep.
On the lagoon side, the buildings are completely transparent and modern to maximize the views of the water, while on the city side, they are formed by solid stone walls and combined with traditional geometric details in the arches, pergolas, and column capitals, creating a dynamic and hybrid image that actually kind of communicates with the towers around, and at the same time, it has that kind of preference to the heritage. And in sharp urban project, there's this project in the middle of the desert, Al-Badair Oasis. And here, this project brings in the traditional city and rural settings together into the heart of the desert, blending them with the desert landscape and colors, and expressing the play of light and shade through simple, repetitive architectural elements, and combining all that with modern tensile structures and utilizing modern design standards for maximum comfort and enjoyment of both indoors and outdoors. Al-Majaz is mainly modern with touches of tradition, if you like, while Al-Badair is more traditional with touches of modernity. Our other projects in Sharjah and elsewhere in the Gulf show variations of this combination and illustrate the potentials of this kind of equation that I'm trying to strike in my approach, which I call the hybrid architectural approach. So I hope that kind of approach can kind of bring together these aspects. Sometimes there's a conflict between the modernity and the tradition that are exhibited in one location or on one project or one building. But actually that kind of juxtaposition, for me, it expresses our current state of identity, which is that we are both local and global. We are kind of conservative and liberal. And that kind of identity, which is always moving and always kind of interacting with the events around it, is what I try to kind of express in my projects. And that kind of balance between the two poles changes from one location and one context to the other. So how can I?
You can click, yeah.
Oh.
Thank you for that, Wael. And just like you showed us some aspects of, how you have a hybrid approach, I'd like to also ask Jonathan to maybe let us know what his experience with designing Al-Fire Retreat was, and how did you combine, these elements of old and modern as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll just share my screen now. The one thing that was very kind of interesting about this particular project for us was that we were actually engaging in both architecture, interior architecture, and also bespoke furniture. And the main thing that was really interesting for this particular project was the actual translation of this kind of holistic approach to these existing buildings and reinterpreting them into a sort of a more contemporary, modern destination. I mean, that's important about this particular project. Al Fire is a destination, and it reveals the nature of the UAE to many people that probably had never been or visited, people that were probably living in the area that hadn't been out to the desert and so forth. So it's actually a kind of a really interesting dialogue where the project had a purpose beyond just accommodating. It was about engaging and revealing with the landscape. The interesting part of it was that, you know, we had these existing structures that were kind of, you know, quite primordial, quite sort of primitive in their design and basic. They were from the 1960s. They were redundant for a number of years, and they were on two opposing sides of a through road, which also had one of the oldest petrol pumps in the UAE. So there's a story there. There is something that wants to be communicated. And as we've talked about before, this is something that's certainly not worth demolishing and replacing with something that's not contextually responsive as a modern building. You want to bring out the key elements within this project, the key aspects of these individual buildings. Neither are they just generic. They had their own qualities and character. And it's how you then engage with that sensitively. You know, it was about a very hands-on approach. You know, you can see the petrol pump on the left. It was a bit redundant, but it had this kind of character. It curated this sort of idea of this cinematic connection with this desert road going through these two locations. And then we looked at ways in which we could create interventions in ways to add the new program. You know, one building was actually a grocery store, which was then converted into a 5-bedroom lodge. The clinic building on the opposite side of the road and the same side as the petrol pump was turned into the restaurant. And then we built a new saltwater spa to add an extension of time that people would go out to the desert and spend. But it was carefully kind of looking at where we would bring in key elements to complement the original buildings. They didn't really have a sort of significant character of, you know, a classicist or something that was prominent. It was about their presence and about the fact that these have been there since the 1960s. They were worthwhile revealing. So the way that we did this was to kind of really look at the way of, you know, introducing Corten steel, repurposing the whole building and restructuring it so that you could actually access the roof safely and be able to have a panoramic view of the whole landscape. And also interjecting with the 5 rooms and so forth. The scale of this building is tiny. So we had to kind of look at how we could cleverly create interior rooms. Complementing this, we also introduced and spoke with Shahrukh. I mean, we were very lucky with this because with, you know, working with Shahrukh, it's a brave move. I mean, I really kind of give credit to you guys for actually going out there and actually committing to this project, because, you know, commercially it's very complicated. You know, it's about its purpose, and it's about the higher sense of engaging people with a landscape that maybe they didn't have, and also giving them more of an experience of an authentic desert experience, but within the sort of sense of a luxury, modern, contemporary, you know, setting. So the saltwater spa was added. We used the idea of saltwater, which drew from the sand. The Corten was heavily influenced by not just being a very good material for arid climates in, you know, the US or in the UAE, but also the fact there's a high content of iron oxide within the sand. So this kind of color that happens, particularly in the evenings with the sand, is phenomenal. And the way in which that then responds with the materials. Looking to the interiors, we kept this loggia. So the way you enter the bedrooms is actually through an open loggia. It's not a concealed, it's not enclosed, it's not actually air conditioned. The rooms are air conditioned themselves. This was the traditional building of that particular grocery store. We reinterpreted and reinstated, you know, the timber detailing, but done in a very precise way so that you can continue the understanding that this building has come from another generation, but in order to kind of work with that and also bring the modern interpretation. The furniture which we designed specifically for the lodge was the reality that we couldn't imagine, even in our eyes. Talking with, you know, the team and Shahrukh, we couldn't imagine bringing in essentially a foreign furniture. It had to be born of the project in its location. That's how it felt the need. And drawing in daylight where we could, considering its aspect towards north light to get a good sense of, you know, ambient light through the day, stargazing in the evenings, and drawing in the materials from the exterior to the interior, because these spaces are really, really kind of, they're quite petite, but it's actually, that's the character of this building. So, you know, adding these different components of this particular project, bringing back to life this project and these two buildings, complementing with the saltwater spa that we have here, giving this purpose, this sunset destination view, and actually really kind of considering these individual components across this through road and how they all relate to each other was a really key aspect. So not just about the architecture of what is traditional, what is modern, it was more about what can we bring to the project in regards to a program, working with the client, you know, to actually make a purpose to go out there, serving people when they go out there, so that this building becomes a voyeur to the landscape. You know, from when you're within, you're constantly looking out. And I think that was the main driving force. You know, the restaurant here, which essentially frames the old building behind it, because we couldn't accommodate the space inside the existing building. We built the core 10 extension so that you essentially preserve a very beautiful facade of the old building, but you also connect the people with the landscape and this ever-changing climate. You know, the sunrise, the sunset, the big winds, the sandstorms, is actually nature. And that's the beauty of this particular project. And, you know, just these two views were just, you know, spending out there and photographing, I mean, was really an amazing experience, because you really do capture all these moments and you can share them with people. And that's why this project became, you know, we were, you know, really amazed by how well this was received internationally, because it revealed something that was unexpected. And specifically, you know, a new aspect and complementing a lot of the contemporary work that was happening in Sharjah and is happening in Sharjah, that's drawing a big international awareness of the contemporary architecture, in which it deals with the historic and the heritage in a very, you know, progressive way. And, you know, furniture was born of this, and it followed the suit of all the materials and the kind of architectural detailing right down into the furniture, into every aspect. So for us, you know, this project is, this project was something that was a real opportunity. And, you know, we knew that we were lucky with the clients backing this project and feeling that it was something that they really wanted to see come to life. And I think, and I hope that, you know, people that have been there and people that want to go there, it does reveal some other aspects, and it gives it a repurpose and a destination, which, you know, I think the UAE at that time and is now is looking for, you know, this authentic experience.
I mean, I could be very biased, but every single person I know that I went to this project was, first of all, fascinated by the beauty of it. The context itself, of course, is beautiful, but then we've transformed these fenced off, you know, buildings into this, and then they would learn more about the buildings themselves and the petrol pump that's there. And I get so many questions of people that are actually interested to know about, you know, the past of that. And it's great to see how a building can influence someone to learn about things, you know, in history. And that's why literally when we saw that fence with the "do not approach" sign, we actually went under the fence, Jonathan, and
but
that sign.
No, but the thing is that when we went for the site for the first time, I mean, you've got these, you know, these pylons, these electrical pylons that go across the desert, but then you've got this amazing mountain range at the side of you, and to the right of you, you've got this constant sand dunes of this rolling desert. It was so cinematic. You know, the road, if this project doesn't have the road and the petrol pump, it's a completely different animal. It had that cinematic effect, and that was something that was really worthwhile. Pulling out and exposing with the new, you know, the new contemporary interventions, so that people can go there and enjoy it and do what you've said, actually engage with the building and reveal the landscape and the skyscape to them. So I you know, that's where, you know, that's where we feel most pride in regards to the respect of that project. It actually facilitated a new interest, and like you said, people got excited about the landscape, about Sharjah, about, you know, the whole context of that place. So yeah, we loved it. It's a very good project to get involved in. And thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So just like again, all these projects that we've been talking about, and Mikhail, you discussed and you've showed us very intriguing projects, the Qasr al-Hisan and so on and so forth. And then what I saw was a very bold approach when it comes to, you know, to something that is very in very close proximity to traditional architecture. So how does that balance? How can you, you know, not overtake the historical buildings?
I think you need to be very humble as a starting point, and really look at the context, look at the existing building, understand the culture and the heritage, and then define what it will take to make it work in the future. And I kind of like YL as well. We like these juxtapositions or things that are typical opposites, but actually work well in reality. Like being humble and being bold at the same time is actually possible, and it works if you do it in the right sequence, by being humble first and then bold afterwards. But and like Jonathan said, I think it's very, very much about understanding the site and understanding the layers of history that is present, and then being very precise in pointing out the things that are value, and preserving and strengthening those while you solve the program or the project. So I think for this project, for the cultural foundation that's also on the Castle Hosn side, we had a building here as well that is in itself very bold, and a beautiful example of modern architecture, but still an architecture that's very well adapted to local culture and to the local climate. So how do we approach a building like that? Is it possible to renovate it and make it work for the future without demolishing it or destroying the values that it already has? So for that building, it took a very gentle approach and a very humble approach, where we basically tried to preserve as much as possible of the building, and only do very selective demolishment of parts of it. So we demolished an addition that was made in the 90s that kind of made the whole organization of the building a bit unclear. And then we did one big kind of intervention, creating an opening from the ground floor of the building to the roof that had a very clear function of bringing daylight into the library. The library was designed in the 70s, where you typically had archive-based libraries, where you went in and to a counter and ordered a book, and then from the archive the book would come to be delivered to you. And of course, a modern library doesn't work like that at all. So we needed daylight in there. We already had this ground floor passage where there's an outdoor kind of diagonal going through the building. And we saw an opportunity together to make an opening through the building and thereby bringing daylight into the library, and at the same time creating access to the roof. Like with the hotel that Jonathan described, you get that possibility of going up and looking at the surroundings, and actually for the first time, I think, really understanding the site when you see the fort and the park and the surrounding city. So that was the only kind of big thing that we actually did there. Everything else was small adjustments and bringing the building kind of back to life, and reintroducing also the original functions of a library and a visual arts center and a theater. The only other kind of bigger thing that we did was opening up the old plant room in the ground floor to have a transition through the building, connecting the park on one side and the city on the other side. And thereby also introducing a new kind of space in the building that's a bit more rough and contemporary than the original or the rest of the building. That corresponds well with a kind of modern gallery feeling. And And then I think if you start very humbly and try to do these small interventions, then you can start to be quite bold. And in the interior of the building, in parts of it, like in the library here, where all the original library furniture was already stripped out when we arrived, we allowed ourselves to be more bold and introduce an interior that's still clearly local, but also clearly contemporary and something that's not part of the original building. But it turned out to work quite well, that even though we in these spaces only preserved the shell and core of the original building, it's the feeling in there still relates to the general feeling of the space, and I think we managed to be bold in the interior, but still very humble to the general feeling of the building. And then of course making the library work with the possibilities for expressing yourself, for playing, for working, for learning, all of the things that you want to do in a contemporary children's library. Even installing a piece like this that's clearly modern and quite bold, but I think since our general approach was quite humble, it still works when you pass through the building and feels like a whole. Yeah,
that's really beautiful, and it's really amazing to see all these spectacular projects all around the UAE, and just like you've showed us, and just like you were saying, you need to be humble, but then you can be bold, and that's really beautiful because we are respecting it. We do love our traditions and our historic buildings, but then we want to also move on with time and see them evolve as well. So it's really beautiful. Thank you. And I think I'll just have, one final question to Al, and then maybe we can move on to questions from the audience. So Wael, when it comes to the durability of traditional buildings, especially in the region, a lot of the materials that have been used are now protected or not available, like coral and other materials. So how was it dealing with designing the master plan for Heart of Sharjah and then adding new materials to the area?
I would like to talk a little bit about the Heart of Sharjah, because it really can be an illustrative project for answering your question, since we had to deal with the local materials that have been used for years, and we have to introduce new materials as well because of the need for durability and other issues. So I would like to kind of share some images. Heart of Sharjah. Okay.
Yeah.
This particular image represents the final concept for a staged implementation scheme over something like 20 years. And it was approved by His Highness in 2010. During the 1990s, several buildings in this historic city were reconstructed or restored using natural materials that were still available at the time. But recently, we faced a shortage of the main traditional building material, which is coral stone, that gives the kind of identity to this kind of structures. Today, not much reconstruction is being considered, and the remaining planned buildings, according to the master plan, will be in the form of new infills. Our approach in the design guidelines was not to confuse new buildings with old ones. And this is actually also a UNESCO direction. New buildings are made of modern materials while reflecting the massing, textures, and colors of the old buildings, and emphasizing the need to create harmony within the overall setting. So they don't need to be constructed anyway with these traditional materials, because we don't want people to think that they've been there for ages. An example of this direction, combined with my hybrid architecture approach, can be seen in the center of this area. which is actually the place where recent years they have been holding what they call the Heritage Days festivities around in April, beginning of April. Now the direction was to keep this area as open as possible for this festival. So what we did actually, to go back and trace the old footprints of houses that used to be there from old photographs and aerial views, and use new materials for paving and landscaping to express the different houses, and different materials for the passages, for the rooms, for the courtyards, and most of the courtyards still had the trees preserved, but the buildings themselves disappeared. So actually, this has transformed this area from an open plaza which had no character. It was actually all paved with concrete blocks, to something that that has the traces and the memory of what was there, and we were happy to see the local people, the survivors, the older generations, to come when they come to this place, and they recognize their old houses that were there, and that this is the tree that they planted, and that kind of human aspect of the interventions that we have done. Although we would have initially wanted to reconstruct these houses or rebuild them, but at the end we came up with a solution that again reflects the tradition or the history of this place, and at the same time caters for contemporary needs. This is actually one of the blocks that we designed, one of the buildings, which is the unit for the management of the heart of Sharjah. And here we try to relate, again, the approach that we try to use is to relate to the past by tracing what was there before, and the structures, the trees that were existing, and try to build something out of it. Actually, this was not one of those important buildings. It was mostly sheds and open spaces, but we transformed that into courtyards, and into two courtyards, and we try to bring in the kind of hybrid architecture approach that I was talking about into this design, whereby also we try to reflect the passive energy measures that made traditional buildings sustainable by using these two courtyards and allowing the kind of passage of air between them and the circulation. And the main thing is that we try to relate the outside of this building to its historic urban context, but also try to distinguish it from, not to make it look a replica of what is there existing. But when you go inside, we created a contemporary setting that is relevant to an office building, with new materials, with concrete, steel, or aluminum, glass, and all the amenities and services that are needed for a modern office building. So, so I think this kind of adaptation and trying to respond to there are so many forces, and this is a historic setting that is being proposed to UNESCO. So we had to really be very careful on the intervention. The intervention had to be sensitive. It had to really reflect all these issues of the guidelines that we have put into the master plan, and it's a kind of a very intricate balance. And again, this goes back to the question, the first question, or the second question that you've asked about this equation. What is the equation? How modern should we go, and how traditional? And I think it's about trying to understand the context, and especially this particular context, has so many layers. It's history, and as well there are new requirements, and you want to bring life into an old city that has been largely demolished and neglected. So I think this is a good example of that approach that we have been talking about, in other projects. But we had one which is in the city, one in the desert, and this is in a historic setting.
Thank you. We've had a question from the audience that was talking about how do you marry concepts from traditional and modern, and I think all of you have answered it in a really nice way, because they were talking about how to not have it in a cliche way where you have the barjeel or just any element put in place without the function. And all of these projects that you've shared beautifully explain that. We are a bit over time. I would like to just answer one more question, maybe. It's actually to Mikkel, but then if anyone would like to add anything, then please do so. So it says that traditional architecture is innovative is amazing. And when do you think we suddenly abandoned our ways, and why? It's a very philosophical one, but I really liked it.
Was the question when we realized?
Yeah, when did we suddenly abandon our ways?
I think it's no coincidence that we start to look at these things now. I think it's partly because of the climate crisis that we're heading into, that we clearly need to look for new answers. Clearly the modern way of doing things that we've done for the past 70 years is not going to work for the future. So we need to look for new ways of living a modern life, but with more respect for nature and for surroundings, and with less consumption altogether. And looking at traditional architecture, it has always been brilliant at exactly that. So there are lots of very kind of low-hanging fruits that we can just go back and pick and reintroduce into the way that we work. But I think that I definitely think that the ecological and kind of climate crisis that we're looking at is a big factor here for the timing.
I think also continuing from what Mikhail has said, and also what's present in all the projects that we've actually showed today, is about repurposing. Talking about climate change, you're talking about the need and the rapid growth, and as Wael said, the Gulf cities, modern Gulf cities, rapidly grew following the oil boom. So they already have embodiment in them. There's some large spaces, lots of things built, and again, the mistake would be to look straight to demolition, because ultimately that is the absolute antithesis of any sustainable approach to anything. It's the biggest factor. So I think what now needs to be considered is this understanding that we need to reflect and look back, but we need to see how we can actually modify and adapt, and consider the hybrid approach, definitely, as well as definitely pushing, is engaging with these structures, engaging with the way that they actually work within the fabric of the city, and actually reintroducing, reprogramming, sort of also in a contemporary way. And I think even with the project in Abu Dhabi that Mikhail was saying, is there was a certain 90s addition to that particular cultural center that didn't work. Take it out. That was a mistake that was done in that period, that didn't think about that particular moment, and now that's no longer relevant. Now we're looking back and seeing, well, we want open space, we want natural light, we want cross ventilation. The fundamental about vernacular is vernacular should change through culture. It should evolve. It isn't heritage, it's tradition. It's the purpose for what you need to do in order to, shelter. Now, climate change and so forth is actually part of what we need to do as a response in a vernacular sense to these climate situations. So it's about really being authentic and being relevant, I think. And it'd be interesting to see if the move and the shift forward, particularly, I think Sharjah has been pioneering that, and Abu Dhabi actually, about reusing and exploring buildings of value and actually looking at it in a very contemporary way, not pastiche, to reinvent and reinvigorate. And I think that will be the character that people will go forward in a much more sensitive and a much more empathetic way.
Yeah.
If I just add one, it's actually a continuation of this, closing statements. from my colleagues. And I think the problem is that for a long time, you know, traditional architecture has been neglected. And traditional architecture is a treasure, really, that we should all continue to highlight. And I think we'll continue to do that forever, I believe. But as we develop more sensitive architecture that is related to place and to environment and to culture, we start to actually create a new tradition, you know, that is in the same kind of level of sensitivity that our forefathers have approached design in the past. And with time, this becomes also a continuation. And there's a rupture that has happened with the, you know, modern interventions and modernization. We are at the stage where we want to restitch that link with the past. I mean, and learn from it. So there are many parts of the Arab world, you know, where they have historic cities are being demolished. You know, whether by war or by government decisions, or we have to really highlight and bring to the highest level, you know, this awareness to the general public about this architecture, and even emphasize and even exaggerate, if you like, the benefits of that architecture, so that at least we start getting that sympathy, that understanding and awareness from the general public. We should not just continue as architects talking amongst each other about it, you know, and creating a few examples here and there that kind of relate it. But I know in my view, and I've been trying to kind of bring in this kind of hybrid architecture as a kind of confrontational, if you like, image, but because I wanted to bring to people the awareness that this architecture has value. You know, you have to really think about it. You stop looking at it as you know, something that is backward, which is the kind of approach that led to the demolition and the disappearance of many Gulf cities, including Kuwait, where I was born. You know, the whole city was obliterated. So I think it is important, and that question is absolutely very interesting, really. When do we stop? I don't think we will stop, because we will just stitch up and continue creating architecture that is sensitive and making our architects aware of that. You know, that's the kind of probably answer that I would give to this interesting, very interesting question.
And your interesting takes on the subject has been really, really great. Thank you so much for your time. It's a constantly debatable topic, I guess, but I feel like we've touched upon it in really, really enlightening and interesting ways. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mikhail, Jonathan, Wael. Thank you for being here. And on behalf of our speakers, myself, and the Shuruk team, I'd like to thank our attendees for their time as well. So stay tuned for our last, but hopefully not least, talk happening next week. And the topic would be light and architecture. So until then, stay safe and goodbye. Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye.
And Eid Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak. Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Bye.